As a startup founder, advisor, and investor, one of the best shows I've ever watched is Silicon Valley. This is, you could say, an oldie, but a goodie. Came out about 8 years ago, 2014, lasted for, I think, 6 seasons. And it was created by Mike Judge, I believe, of Beavis and Butthead fame. Gives you an idea of where we're going to go with this. If you have not seen Silicon Valley, I highly recommend it. But also, spoilers ahead. We are going to talk about watching Silicon Valley as I've revisited it 8 years later. For me, I didn't even actually start watching it probably until it was about 2 years in, because I only got into startups in about 2015 is when I started to create my first startup. And so I watched Silicon Valley season one as it was getting into season two, and I became completely enthralled. But by that time, I had already had some experience down in Silicon Valley itself, down in San Francisco, Palo Alto, Mountain View, and I had interviewed down at Y Combinator. So I was fully immersed into the Silicon Valley culture. And I thought it'd be a great idea to revisit Silicon Valley episode by episode, pull out lessons as I reflect back on all the years, and also what would be helpful for all the entrepreneurs, startup founders that we're working with today. Here we go. Let's take a look. Episode one starts off with the gang. This is Richard Hendricks over here, and he's based on the typical startup programmer, geeky kind of guy, wearing the hoodie all the time, etc. You can think of him like Mark Zuckerberg. I believe they also made him out kind of like a young Jack Dorsey before Jack Dorsey went all hipster with nose rings and, the hipster beard and things like that. And so they're living in this incubator, and I'm going to get to some of the lessons, and I just share and talk about the highlights that I see, and it just gave me fond memories watching this. They are living in this, quote, incubator that's run by this gentleman known as Erlich Bachman, which is probably my least favorite main character of the show. I just did not like him at all, but it's a really good example of sort of some of the personalities and the grandiose narcissism that can happen when it comes to tech. Just look at the shirt. And he's running this incubator where people can live there and just work on their startups, and he gets 10%. Now, that may seem like a lot, but I remember back in the day when I was looking to move to Silicon Valley, I was looking up rent and pricing just to be in San Francisco. And yeah, would I give up 10% to live in a place for free to just be able to work on the startup? I definitely think about it back in the day. It's so expensive. It's crazy. But anyways, not an ideal situation. They're all living in this place, and, they're coding away, hacking away. Now, this episode is called MVP, or minimum viable product, MVP. And this is going to be an important term. What I really like about the Silicon Valley show is that it uses real terms. It was very well written. They brought in actual Silicon Valley executive types and people who were founders to consult on the show. And I thought it was really great. So minimum viable product stands for what is the minimum amount of effort or resources, or a minimum type of product with just the minimum amount of features and functions that can prove viability in the marketplace. And you're going to see throughout Silicon Valley, which is the show Silicon Valley, which is one of the great things about the show, but one of the things that I think is kind of misleading. And the one big problem that I have with the show is that there are minimum viable products thrown all over the place. You're going to see app ideas like Nip Alert, where it's about, the app detects the nipples of the closest person, like exposed nipples. one, I guess Ehrlich had one where it detects water fountains, all over the place. You're going to see them all over again. But here's the product that Richard Hendricks created. He created something called Pied Piper, which allows you to search for the copyright and all the legal issues before you're going to use a piece of music. This is the issue with that. Nobody wants that program. And so Ehrlich Bachman is giving Richard the gears and says, nobody cares about searching up the legal ramifications of using music online. And that's the issue, that Richard has built something that people don't want and aren't going to use. But that's the common theme, which is kind of the running gag through this, is that there's always stuff that people are building that people aren't going to watch. Even the doctor, Richard's physician, gets in on it, and he's trying to pitch apps. And there are so many apps that just don't have a place in the marketplace. There is no need. Nobody's going to use them. Nobody's going to want them. So you built an app that that's not going to go anywhere. That's not going to get traction. And therefore, MVP is important, because if you put in the minimum amount of work to create a minimally viable product to invalidate or validate your assumptions that people are going to want it, well, you can, as they say in lean startup, fail early, fail fast, fail cheap, which is an important lesson for us to learn. However, it's a little misleading, and I'll explain this in a moment. So what happens is Richard gives his Pied Piper app to these programmers, okay? And that's the bro culture of programmers. And so they're going and they're kind of joking and they're bullying him. Send us the app, we're going to take a look. But then they actually look at the app and they go, wait a second. So they're just curious. And they said, how does this app do a search so fast in the compression space? Kind of getting technical type thing. And they can't understand it. So they're looking at it and they're kind of marveling that, wait a second, this Richard guy has created something that's pretty ingenious, a new type of compression algorithm. And I had a personal experience where I was working with an organization, a startup way back in the day in New York, and they had created a compression algorithm for music that was actually, I believe, 30 times faster and better than MP3. And they immediately started getting tons of money. And we did all these startup parties in New York. I never did a startup party in the Valley, but in New York Startup Alley, definitely had my share of fun times. And so this is this point of the culture where something new and technological really got the eyeballs or got attention. And so these programmers and the gang, this team that worked at a company called rlich, which is a spoof on Google, they realize, wait a second, this Richard guy's onto something. Of course, Richard has no idea. He's just creating Pied Piper, an app that nobody's going to use or nobody wants. And so they let Gavin Belson know, and he's the CEO of rlich. He's this megalomaniac, this total grander than life Silicon Valley type character, which is based on the Larry Ellison's, like the founders of Google, and the Mark Benioffs of Salesforce.com. And he starts to realize, wait a second, because they're always looking for a competitive edge. They've blown up just like Google. They've got the campus like right there. And it's the contrast. Gavin Belson is the contrast to the Ehrlich Bachman character. Ehrlich Bachman is the same character basically, but he's running a little tiny useless incubator and looking for the diamonds in the rough, where Gavin Belson's already done it. But it's the same thing. They're trying to get ahead by finding these ideas. And this is part of the Silicon Valley culture that is true, that if you're not coding, you're not technical in that aspect, you're trying to invest. And this whole world of VCs or companies that act like VCs that are trying to buy into technology or create innovative technology breakthroughs for their own. Then what happens is Richard, he pitches this guy, Peter Thiel. So here's this guy, Peter Gregory, that is based on Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is of Palantir fame, and he did PayPal. and he is the multi-billionaire that pays people $100,000 to skip college and then just work on their stuff. In fact, it's a great program because guess who came out of that? Vitalik Buterin, the guy who created Ethereum. So Peter Thiel, he just has no use for classic education, whatsoever. Anyways, he's giving this talk and just dragging on education. He's dunking on education in his TED talk. Now, here's the thing. This is sort of the romantic fantasy thing of Silicon Valley, where, great founders skip school and school is completely useless. Now, I agree. An 18-year-old goes out and takes $100,000 loan and comes out with a useless degree. That's a terrible decision. However, if you really look at the stats, there's such a small percentage of founders that can drop out of college and do really well. It's kind of misleading, and that's the romantic version. Anyways, stay in school. I wish I would stay in school. I dropped out for my startup as well, and it didn't turn out like Mark Zuckerberg or all these people that drop out of school and become billionaires. Anyway, Richard Hendricks pitching Pied Piper to the Peter Gregory character, and they're talking, and the pitch does not go really well. But here's where the magic starts to happen. And this is where you got like people who produce music standing outside the club waiting for the club, and they're basically stalking someone like Snoop Dogg or Kanye, and they come on, please just listen to my track type thing, listen to my beats, etc. So then Gavin Belson, obviously he knows about it and he calls a meeting with Richard Hendricks and offers him something like $500,000, something like that, the $1 million, what have you. And then Peter Gregory calls him and they start a bidding war because Peter Gregory starts to chime in on, wait a second, Richard Hendricks has got something here. It doesn't always happen like that. It very rarely happens like this, where people suddenly discover your genius. And that's one of the issues that I see with this is a lot of founders just think, oh, well, just because I have a great idea or I can create something, somehow people are magically going to find me. It's not that easy. It takes a ton of work to get out there, especially today because it's so competitive to get in front of VCs. Anyways, this bidding war starts to happen, and Richard gets a chance to walk away with $10 million just for his minimum viable product. A very nice payday, 10 million bucks. Then Ehrlich Bachman, the incubator guy, the sleazy, douchey incubator guy, would have walked away with $1 million, and then he would have been able to split it. Not a bad payday, but Peter Gregory ends up offering him $200,000 for 5% of the company. And that's the typical pre-seed deal. I'm just going to give you a little bit of money up front, but you get to keep the majority of your company and build something that could be $1 billion, which is called a unicorn. A company, before it being publicly traded, is worth $1 billion. So keeping 95% of $1 billion company is way better than just walking away with 10 million bucks. And so Peter Gregory is challenging Richard. You could be building a company and you could be having greater ownership in it. And this is going to be this constant issue between just sell out, take the money, or do you want to take a little bit of money and build something? And ultimately, Richard decides to take, spoiler alert, the $200,000 to build his company. Peter Gregory, obviously based upon Peter Thiel, and there's going to be a whole bunch of different dynamics that happen. Unfortunately, through the show, the actor that plays Peter Gregory ends up passing away, and they write him out of the show. But then some other shenanigans starts to happen. So it was an unfortunate thing because it would have really been fascinating to watch this character play out over all the seasons. So what do we have to learn from this? This is where the concept of the MVP is where I would love for founders who want to do startups to really think through. Unless you are incredibly technical and you can start popping off MVPs in your sleep. Mark Zuckerberg was like this. He basically just could create different apps and was just hacking away until you come to something that, wait a second, I've stumbled onto something. That's extremely rare. the issue in this show, and it rightly points out, but it doesn't really hammer it home. And so this romantic version of, I'm just going to create an MVP and somehow it's going to get funded, someone's going to discover it, is very misleading, especially for non-technical founders or founders who just don't understand Silicon Valley, how the Valley works and what have you. So what happens is founders create solutions looking for problems instead of starting with a problem looking for a solution, or a problem that's going to solve a problem to solve, and then you create a solution. For example, nip alert. Like, who has that problem? And this gets hilariously invalidated by the second episode, and we'll talk about it when it gets there. But the issue is that Richard doesn't go through market validation or idea validation to figure out, wait a second, would anybody even want to look up copyright infringement and do a search on any issues before I use music? Hell no. Nobody cared about that, which Bachman quaintly points out. And there are many apps that are down this same vein throughout the show. So what Richard needed to do was first start and say, what are people trying to do? What problems can I solve? And then I happen to have a great compression algorithm that can do that a lot faster. Or go and figure out what issues in the industry or what areas of tech are suffering from compression issues, and we can solve that. To the show's credit, they go through this and they explain, and we start to get into a proper or appropriate startup cycle, if you will, going from problem solution fit, trying to figure out product market fit, et cetera, which is hilarious. But if you just watch a show at face value, I know a lot of founders that watch Silicon Valley and they just immediately thought, well, I'm just going to create an MVP and it's going to be great and all this stuff, and I'm going to get discovered. And it just does not work like that. And therefore, it's an entertaining show, but the education, you have to dig for the nuggets there. And quite frankly, it's something that I realized later on as I've been advising so many different startups and doing a lot of startups on my own, and many of them failing because of this very issue. A lot of founders will talk to you about that and say they started creating a solution that nobody really wanted. Well, that's not the way you want to go. You want to first start out with the problem, analyze it, validate the problem, and there's a large market for that problem, and then create your MVP. There you have it. That's the one major takeaway that I would take from Silicon Valley episode 1. I've already watched Silicon Valley episode 2. I'm rewatching all of them. Got some great lessons. It gets better and better and better for these amazing nuggets for all you founders out there or entrepreneurs thinking about getting into the startup game. If you have not checked it out as of yet, I hope you can watch it. Plus, I got a real special surprise. I got a really unique app that I'm using, a new MVP that just came out with one of our founders. It's going to be great. And I've been using this app to watch the show, take my notes, and create these asynchronous watch parties, if you will, that you can join me on that. I'm going to keep it under wraps just for a little bit while we work out the kinks. But I got some really fun stuff that we can do together as we go on this journey as founders, or if you're advising founders or just thinking about becoming a founder yourself. Hope this was helpful. Stick around for the next episode. See you in the next video.